Cicatrix Maledictum had torn the galaxy in half. That was the only way the survivors of Cadia described it. Not a wound, not a rift, but a tearing, as though reality itself had been seized by hands older than stars and pulled apart like wet parchment. The great rift stretched from the eastern fringe to the segmentum solar, a scar of churning warp energy visible to the naked eye from 1,000 worlds, and every psyker who looked at it directly either wept blood or stopped being human in any meaningful sense. Cadia itself was gone. Shattered by Abaddon's final push, the pylons broken, the planet cracked like an egg and scattered across the void. What remained were debris fields, refugee convoys, and a thin Ultramarines patrol cordon trying to maintain order in a system that had lost its reason for existing. Sergeant Gaius Castor of the Ultramarines' 5th Company had been on perimeter duty for 11 days. His squad of 8 held position aboard the strike cruiser Purity of Macridge, monitoring auger returns across the Cadian debris field for chaos stragglers, relic salvagers, and the occasional warp-drunk demon that slipped through reality's fraying edges. It was grim, methodical work. Castor preferred it to the alternative, which was thinking about what the rift meant for everything that came next. The auger screamed at 0400 ship time. Not metaphorically. The rating manning the sensor console physically recoiled from his station. Hands pressed to his ears, mouth open in a soundless cry. 3 psychers in the adjacent sanctum simultaneously collapsed. The ship's Geller field, inactive in real space, dormant, flickered on without being activated, as though something in the vessel's machine spirit decided independently that protection was needed. On the auger display, a contact had appeared. No approach vector. No translation from warp space, no entry signature, no vessel. Simply, presence. Roughly 2 kilometers off the port bow, floating in the debris field between a shattered Cadian munitions platform and the frozen corpse of an ecclesiarchy transport. The contact was roughly human in dimension. Alone. Radiating something the auger's cogitator struggled to categorize, not warp energy precisely but adjacent to it, the way heat is adjacent to fire. What in the throne's name is that? Castor said. Nobody answered because nobody knew. He took a Thunderhawk down personally. Brought 7 veterans. A combat psyker named Brother Iventus who had stopped trembling by the time they launched, and enough firepower to kill a minor demon prince. The debris field made approach slow. Chunks of Cadian bedrock the size of hablocks drifted past the viewport, and Castor caught himself staring at a section of wall still bearing a Cadian regimental banner, frozen and pristine in the void, as though the planet had tried to save at least that much of itself before dying. The figure was standing on a fragment of Cadian ferrocrete the size of a landing pad. Standing, in vacuum, without a void suit. Castor's first thought was chaos corruption. Some warp-touched abomination wearing a human silhouette. His second thought, when the Thunderhawk's luminous rays swept over the figure fully, was that whatever this was, it was not from the Imperium. The armor was black and angular, unlike any pattern in the Codex Astartes or any Chaos warplate he had catalogued. A helmet that suggested nothing human behind it. A long dark cloak that moved in vacuum as though responding to a wind that didn't exist. One hand rested at its side. The other held, loosely, a device, cylindrical, unfamiliar, that Castor's combat instincts immediately flagged as a weapon. The figure turned toward the Thunderhawk before they had completed approach. It knew they were coming. It had always known. They landed 20 meters away. Castor disembarked in full Mk.7 plate, bolter raised, 6 veterans flanking him in practiced formation. Iventus stayed at the ramp, face pale, lips moving in a prayer Castor couldn't hear. The figure watched them cross the ferrocrete fragment with the patience of something that had stopped being impressed by armed men a very long time ago. "Identify yourself," Castor said, his voice carrying through external vox grill. "By order of the Adeptus Astartes and the divine authority of the God Emperor of Mankind, you will submit to identification and..." The cylindrical device ignited. A blade of pure crimson energy extended from one end. For feet of focused light that hummed at a frequency that resonated somewhere behind Castor's sternum. A sound less heard than felt. The figure held it at its side, not raised, not threatening. Just present. The red light threw harsh shadows across the debris field, painting the drifting Cadian banner in the color of blood. "I am Darth Vader," the figure said. The voice came without a vox grill, resonating from within the helmet with a depth that seemed to carry its own gravity. "Dark Lord of the Sith, I have questions. You will answer them." Adeptus made a sound behind Castor, not fear exactly, something worse. The sound of a man who has spent his life sensing the warp and has suddenly sensed something that the warp itself appears to be paying attention to. Castor raised his bolter anyway. He was Ultramarines. "It was what you did." "Brother," Adeptus said quietly, and his voice had the flat, careful quality of someone delivering a medical diagnosis. "I would recommend against firing." The force that seized Castor's bolter arm was invisible, inexorable, and entirely unimpressed with ceramite plate. It didn't hurt. It simply stopped him, the way a wall stops a thrown stone, with complete indifference to the stone's intentions. His 6 veterans found their weapons turning in their hands, pointing skyward, held there by nothing visible and nothing they could fight. Vader looked at them. The red blade hummed. "Now," he said, "where am I?" Castor was not a man who frightened easily. He had held a choke point on Vardus Prime for 19 hours against a Chaos Warband 3 times his squad size. He had watched Brother Sergeant Hellion die to a bloodthirster's axe and kept his squad moving through the grief because stopping meant dying. He had stood on Cadia's surface during the final hours and felt the planet shuddering beneath his boots like a dying animal. And he had kept his bolter up and his voice steady for the men around him because that was what sergeants did. He answered Vader's question. Not because the invisible grip on his arm compelled honesty. It only compelled stillness. But because 19 years of Astartes service had taught him that information was a tool, and a tool given willingly cost less than one taken by force. He told Vader the name of the system, the name of the planet that used to be here, the name of the rift tearing the sky open above them. He kept his voice level and his eyes on that crimson blade the entire time, cataloging its energy output, its stability, the way it responded microscopically to Vader's breathing. Vader listened without interrupting. That alone was unusual in Castor's experience. Beings of significant power tended toward monologuing. This one simply absorbed information with the focused attention of a general reading tactical maps. "This warp," Vader said when Castor finished. "You describe it as a dimension of chaos energy, inhabited by entities, accessible through psychic sensitivity." "Broadly accurate," Castor said. "And your emperor, he sits on a throne. He is not dead but cannot act. He maintains a beacon, the Astronomicon, that allows navigation through this warp." "Yes. For 10,000 years. Yes." A pause. The crimson blade hummed. Somewhere in the debris field, a chunk of Cadia the size of a titan slowly rotated, its shadow sweeping across them like a sundial marking time in a dead system. "Your galaxy," Vader said, "is at war with itself and with entities from another dimension, has been for millennia, and your only protection is a dying god on a throne and soldiers who fight with faith as their primary weapon." Castor considered the framing. "That is not inaccurate." It was not a sound of sympathy. It was the sound of a man recalibrating threat assessments. The blade retracted. The grip on Castor's arm released. His veterans slowly, carefully lowered their weapons to non-threatening positions, not holstered, because they were ultramarines and holstering under these circumstances would have been tactically absurd, but lowered. Adeptus at the ramp exhaled something that might have been a prayer or might have been relief or might have been both. The Thunderhawk brought them back to the purity of Macridge with Vader seated in the troop bay, arms resting on his knees, gauntlet hands loose and still. He did not speak during transit. He did not need to. His presence filled the bay the way smoke fills a room. Gradually, completely, until breathing anything else seemed like the aberration. 3 of Castor's veterans kept their eyes forward with the rigid discipline of men, who understood that looking at something directly sometimes made it more real than was comfortable. Captain Evander Price was waiting in the hangar bay with 12 more Astartes, a Muggos biologist from the ship's Mechanicus contingent, and an expression that suggested he had read Castor's Vox report twice and believed it approximately 40%. He believed it 100% by the time Vader stepped off the ramp. The Muggos Biologus, a compact, augmented woman named Seren who had more mechadendrites than fingers and eyes that had been replaced with red optical lenses sometime in the last century, went very still in a way that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with professional hunger. Her lenses cycled through magnification settings with an audible click-click-click as she scanned Vader from across the hangar. Whatever her augmented senses told her, it was enough to make her take 3 involuntary steps forward before she caught herself. Price stepped in front of her. His focus remained on Vader. "I am Captain Evander Price, 5th Company, Ultramarines Chapter, Adeptus Astartes, servant of the God Emperor of Mankind." His voice had the formal weight of someone reciting catechism under pressure. "You are aboard the strike cruiser Purity of Macridge. You are not a prisoner. You are also not free to move without escort until we understand what you are and what your presence in this system means." Vader regarded him. Reasonable. Price blinked. He had prepared for several responses. Reasonable had not been among them. "You are not chaos-touched," Vader continued, with the certainty of someone who had spent decades reading the dark currents beneath people's surfaces. "You believe genuinely in your Emperor. You fight because you were made to fight and because you have chosen to believe the fighting means something. Your authority structure is rigid but functional. Your Muggos behind you wants to dissect me." Seren made a sound that was professionally neutral and fooled no one. "These are observations," Vader said. "Not criticisms. I have commanded soldiers. I recognize the architecture of military devotion." He turned his helmet slowly, taking in the hangar. The row of Thunderhawks, the ranked Astartes, the chapter iconography on every surface. "Your Imperium is besieged. You are outnumbered in ways your theology helps you refuse to quantify. And something tore a hole in the fabric of your reality and deposited me in the wreckage of one of your most important fortresses." A pause. "I do not believe in coincidence." Price looked at Castor. Castor looked back with an expression that said, "I told you." "We're going to need to contact the Inquisition," Price said quietly. Vader heard it. Of course he heard it. "This Inquisition, they investigate threats to your Imperium. Among other things. Then contact them." The helmet turned back toward Price. "I will speak with whoever holds genuine authority in this region. I have no interest in speaking with intermediaries indefinitely." The Purity of Macridge's Vox array began transmitting within the hour. The reply came in 6. It came from Inquisitor Aldrich Valdris, Ordo Malleus, and it contained only 4 words. "Do not let it sleep." Inquisitor Aldrich Valdris arrived like a verdict. No fanfare, no formal escort request. His black Corvus Blackstar simply appeared on the Purity of Macridge's auger returns at 0200 ship time, running silent, broadcasting an inquisitorial cipher that made the ship's communications officer go pale and patch it through to Captain Price without a single question. The Black Star docked with the efficiency of a man who had done this on 1,000 ships and regarded the crews of all of them as furniture arranged for his convenience. Valdris himself was not physically impressive. That was the first thing Castor noticed, standing honor guard at the hangar entrance. Medium height, lean, somewhere between 50 and 150 years old in the way that Inquisitors sometimes were. Age redistributed by Juvenat treatments into something that suggested experience without advertising it. Gray coat, storm gray, high-collared, bearing no ornamentation except the rosette at his breast and a single electu on his right hand that Castor recognized as an Ordo Malleus binding ward. He carried a plasma pistol he had clearly never stopped being comfortable with and a power sword he had clearly used recently enough that the blade showed microscoring along the edge. His eyes were the color of old ice and they went directly to Vader the moment he entered the holding chamber. Vader was seated. They had given him a room, not a cell. Price had made the distinction carefully, understanding instinctively that the difference between a room and a cell in this case was largely theoretical but symbolically significant. The room contained a table, 2 chairs, and a viewport showing the debris field. Vader had not slept. Castor suspected he did not sleep the way humans slept, that whatever rest his physiology required happened in the dark behind that helmet in a way that left him perpetually, unsettlingly alert. Valdris dismissed Castor and the honor guard with a gesture. Castor withdrew to the corridor and stood outside the sealed door, which was entirely useless from a tactical standpoint and which he did anyway because standing outside sealed doors was something sergeants did when the situation inside was above their authority grade. He could hear nothing. The door was void-sealed. Inside, according to the account Valdris provided in his subsequent report, which Castor read 3 weeks later when it was partially declassified for chapter review. The conversation began with Valdris conducting a standard Ordo Malleus threat assessment, which involved a sequence of psychic probing techniques designed to identify chaos corruption, demon possession, or warp taint in subjects who might not be aware of their own contamination. Vader dismantled the first probe before it landed. Not aggressively, the way you'd move a hand that had reached for something on your desk without asking. The probe simply stopped, held at a distance by something that Valdris described in his report as a focused negation of intent, operating through a medium I cannot fully categorize but which shares certain structural properties with warp energy while remaining distinct from it in ways that matter. "You are a psyker," Valdris said. "I am not familiar with that term," Vader said. "You manipulate energy through mental will. You affect the physical world through non-physical means. We call it the Force." Valdris sat. He had the quality Castor had noticed of a man who recalibrated without showing the recalibration happening. The warp responds to your presence. Every psyker on this ship registered your arrival as a significant event. The Geller field activated spontaneously. "Your warp is aware of me," Vader said. "I am aware of it. We have been conducting a mutual assessment since I arrived. It is loud, undisciplined. It reaches like something that has never been taught to do otherwise. The entities within it are opportunistic. They taste something familiar in what I carry and mistake familiarity for vulnerability." A pause waited with something that was not quite contempt and not quite warning. "They are wrong." Valdris studied him. "The force you describe, this energy you manipulate, where does it originate?" "All living things. It binds the galaxy together. It has a light aspect and a dark aspect. I serve the dark. Chaos serves the dark." "Chaos," Vader said, "serves nothing, consumes. There is a difference between wielding darkness and being devoured by it." The helmet turned slightly. "Your chaos gods are what happens when darkness is worshipped rather than mastered. I have seen what worship does to power. I have no interest in becoming someone's instrument." Valdris was quiet for a long moment. Outside in the corridor, Castor shifted his weight and stared at the wall and thought about nothing useful. "You arrived through the Cicatrix Maledictum," Valdris said finally. "The Great Rift. A tear between real space and the warp of unprecedented scale. Something pulled me through. A convergence of energies during a ritual I was conducting in my own galaxy. The mechanism was not unlike certain force techniques involving spatial displacement, but the scale and the destination were unintended. You want to return." Vader's answer was not immediate. When it came, it was measured in a way that suggested the question had been considered more thoroughly than the pause indicated. "I want to understand where I am first. A commander who prioritizes retreat over assessment is a commander who retreats into ambushes." Valdris picked up his data slate. He set it down again. He looked at the viewport and the drifting ruins of Cadia beyond it, and appeared to be having an internal argument with himself that the outcome of had already been decided before he began. "There are factions who will want to use you," he said. "The Mechanicus will want to study your biology and your weapon. Elements within the Inquisition will want to classify you extremis diabolis and have this ship reduced to atoms. Chaos will send representatives. It always does, for something like you." "And you," Vader said. Valdris picked up his data slate again. This time he kept it. "I am Ordo Malleus. My mandate is the destruction of demonic threats. You are not a demon." He stood. "But I am not certain you are not a threat. Until I am, you remain under my authority." "You are welcome to that belief," Vader said. "For as long as it remains useful to both of us." It was not a concession. Both of them knew it. Archmagos Dominus Seren did not sleep either, but in her case this was a matter of biological fact rather than philosophical discipline. She had removed the relevant neural architecture sometime during her 3rd century of service to the Omnicia, replacing it with a low-power cogitation cycle that processed data while her biological remainder rested in a standing cradle bolted to the floor of her mobile laboratorium. During that cogitation cycle, in the 18 hours since Vader had stepped off the Thunderhawk ramp and her optical lenses had begun their frantic magnification cycling, she had compiled 47 pages of preliminary analysis based entirely on passive auger readings, atmospheric biosignature sampling, and the electromagnetic profile of the Crimson Blade weapon, which she had designated in her notes as Device Omicron Sanguine pending formal classification. She had cross-referenced her findings against the Mechanicus databases she carried 17 terabytes of biological, technological, and esoteric knowledge accumulated across 2 centuries of field research, and found 0 matching entries for any of it. 0. For a dominus of her seniority, 0 matches was not a frustration. It was an invitation. She requested a formal audience through Captain Price, who forwarded it to Inquisitor Valdris, who approved it with the annotation observed only, no physical contact, no active scanning without subject consent. An annotation Seren read carefully and interpreted with the precision of someone who understood that consent was a negotiable concept when the Omnicia's hunger for knowledge was involved. Vader received her in the same room. He was standing at the viewport when she entered, watching the debris field with the focused stillness of a man conducting surveillance rather than contemplating. He turned when the door opened and Seren felt her optical systems immediately begin their cycling again. The electromagnetic signature was even more pronounced up close, a field of something her instruments recorded as bioelectric but her intuition categorized as considerably more than that. Archmagos, he said. He had been briefed on her title. He used it with the automatic precision of someone accustomed to using ranks correctly as a matter of operational discipline. My Lord Vader. She had decided on the honorific after 17 pages of deliberation. Something about him made honorifics feel structurally necessary. I will be direct. I wish to understand what you are. Most beings that have wished that, Vader said, have found the answer instructive but not comfortable. I am Mechanicus. Comfort is an inefficiency I excised long ago. She advanced 2 steps. Her mechadendrites spread slightly, not threateningly, the way a scholar's hands open when approaching a text. Your biology. You are human in fundamental architecture, but there are anomalies. Microscopic biological units in your blood that my passive sampling cannot fully characterize. They respond to your intentions. They appear to mediate the connection between your nervous system and the energy field you manipulate. Vader was still. Midichlorians. Is that their designation? In my galaxy. He regarded her with what she had come to recognize, in the 18 hours of passive observation, as his version of considered engagement, a quality of attention that was neither warm nor cold but genuinely evaluative. They are present in all living things. In high concentrations they allow sensitivity to the Force. In sufficient concentrations they allow mastery of it. Seren's mechadendrites were doing things she had not consciously directed them to do, reaching for her sampling equipment with the autonomous urgency of a nervous system responding to stimulus before the mind catches up. She stilled them deliberately. The Omnicia teaches that all knowledge is sacred, that the understanding of biological mechanisms is the highest form of devotion to the machine god. She paused. I am requesting a blood sample. No. The scientific value. No. Not hostile. The way you say no to rain, a statement of reality rather than argument. What I carry in my blood is not a mechanism to be catalogued. It is a relationship between living matter and the fundamental energy of existence. You would learn its chemistry and understand none of its nature, and the attempt would convince you that you understood more than you do. That is more dangerous than ignorance. Seren processed this. Her cogitator ranked it as a statistically unusual response. Most subjects, when confronted with Mechanicus authority and the implicit weight of the Omnicia's mandate, found compliance easier than resistance. You speak as someone who has seen knowledge weaponized. I have done it myself, Vader said. There was something in the cadence of that admission that was not quite regret and not quite warning but occupied the space between them with a density that her emotional processing subroutines, the few she retained, flagged as significant. I will show you the weapon. Seren went very still. Vader reached to his belt and unclipped the cylindrical device she had designated Omicron Sanguine. He held it horizontally, extended toward her. Not ignited, not activated, simply present in his palm. The casing was black and silver, worn in the specific way that things worn by their makers for decades become worn. Not degraded but personalized, shaped by use into something that fits one hand and one hand only. Do not attempt to open it, he said. Do not attempt to scan its interior components with active augury. You may examine the exterior. She reached out. Her mechadendrites, more honest than her hands, were trembling. The casing was metal she could not identify, not any alloy in her database, not any Mechanicus classified material, not any Xenos substrate on record. The workmanship was extraordinary. Tolerances so fine her finest mechadendrite tip could not find a seam where seams should have been. And it was warm, not from recent use. Warm the way living things are warm, with an interior heat that had nothing to do with power cells or thermal discharge. The crystal inside, she said, because her passive readings had detected it, focuses the energy. A Kyber crystal. They are alive in the way that the Force is alive. They choose their users. A pause. This one chose me a long time ago, under circumstances I do not discuss. Seren withdrew her mechadendrites slowly, with the careful reverence of someone returning a relic to an altar. Her cogitator was generating queries faster than she could prioritize them. She set them aside. There was one question that mattered more than the others. Your weapon. Your biology. This Force. She looked up at the helmet. Are you the only one, in your galaxy, who carries what you carry? No, Vader said. But the others who carry it as I do are few. And we are at war with each other. Outside the viewport, a piece of Cadia drifted past. On its surface, frozen into the ferrocrete, was the partial impression of a Cadian boot. Someone who had been standing there when the world ended, preserved in stone like a fossil. Seren looked at it, then back at Vader. In that respect, she said quietly, you will find this galaxy has much in common with your own. The Cientian sorcerer made contact on the fourth day. It did not announce itself through the Vox network or attempt physical boarding. Such directness was beneath the aesthetic sensibilities of those who served the Changer of Ways. Instead it arrived as a voice inside the head of every psyker aboard the Purity of Macridge simultaneously, speaking in 11 languages at once, each sentence grammatically correct in all 11, each carrying a slightly different meaning depending on which language your mind chose to hear it in first. The ship's 3 sanctioned psychers reported it immediately. The 2 unsanctioned crew members who heard it did not report it, because the voice had already begun doing things to their perception of loyalty that would require an inquisitorial purge team to fully address 3 weeks later. Castor learned about the contact secondhand, from Valdris, who summoned him to the command strategium with the expression of a man adding new variables to an equation that was already producing answers he disliked. Vader, it emerged, had heard the voice too. He had been the only non-psyker aboard to do so, which told Valdris several things about the nature of the Force and its relationship to the warp that he was not entirely pleased to know. Vader had listened to the voice, assessed it, and then, according to his own account, delivered to Valdris with the flat precision of a military debrief, responded to it. Not aloud. Not through any mechanism the ship's instruments recorded. Through whatever channel the voice had used to reach him, simply reversed. What did you say to it? Valdris asked. I told it I would hear its offer, Vader said. Once. In person. And that if it sent intermediaries instead of coming itself, I would consider that an indication of weakness and treat it accordingly. Valdris stared at him. You invited a Cientian entity aboard an Astartes strike cruiser. I invited it to present itself honestly rather than whispering through other people's minds like something afraid of direct confrontation. The helmet tilted slightly. In my experience, entities that rely exclusively on manipulation do so because direct engagement exposes their limitations. I wished to identify those limitations before they became relevant in a less controlled context. Castor, standing at the Strategium entrance, looked at the ceiling with the focused attention of a man who has realized he is in a room where decisions are being made that will feature in inquisitorial records for decades, and wants his expression to convey appropriate neutrality. Valdris called in his personal retinue, a combat psyker, 2 death cult assassins, and a hulking Astartes in Terminator plate who served as his permanent bodyguard, and stationed them at intervals throughout the chamber. He also, without stating why, placed his hand on his plasma pistol and left it there. The entity arrived at midnight ship time. It did not come through the hull or the Vox systems or the minds of the crew. It stepped, with the casual spatial arrogance of something that regarded walls as suggestions, directly into the Strategium, trailing behind it a shimmer of iridescent light that bent the geometry of the room slightly. The angles of the walls becoming subtly wrong, the overhead lumens casting shadows that moved independently of their sources. It wore a shape that was almost human. Tall, robed in layers of shifting blue and gold, a face that changed expression faster than expression should change, eyes that were different colors in different moments and all of them the color of calculation. It looked at Vader with an attention that was, even by Tsientian standards, focused. "You are unprecedented," it said. Its voice had the quality of multiple voices in precise agreement. In 10,000 years of observation, in the tracking of 10 billion probability threads across this galaxy and adjacent spaces, we have never recorded a being of your specific configuration. Force-sensitive, dark aspect, alien to this reality. And yet the warp knows you. It smiled with too many of its facial muscles. "How delightful. Your name," Vader said. "Names are." "Your name," Vader repeated, and the weight in it was not a request wearing request's clothing. It was a demand that had stopped pretending. The entity's smile did not falter, but its eyes shifted through 4 colors in rapid succession. "You may call me Orenthal." "Orenthal," Vader said it once, filing it, assigning it the flat permanence of a cataloged threat. "You served Sench. I serve change. Sench is the most refined expression of change available in this reality." Orenthal's robes shifted, new patterns emerging in the fabric as though the cloth were thinking. "Which brings me to you. You are a point of discontinuity, Lord Vader, an unplanned variable in a galaxy where all variables are, eventually, planned for. My master finds unplanned variables either deeply threatening or deeply useful, and has sent me to determine which you are. And if I am threatening, then this conversation ends differently than you'd prefer." Orenthal's tone was genuinely conversational, the way a scientist is conversational when discussing outcomes they find equally interesting regardless of which occurs. "But I do not believe you are. I believe you are useful. I believe you want to return to your galaxy. I believe the mechanism for that return exists within the warp, accessible through rituals my master can provide, navigable through knowledge we possess that no one else in this reality does." A pause calibrated for effect. "I believe you are pragmatic enough to hear this offer fully before refusing it." Vader was still for 3 seconds. Castor counted them. "I am listening," Vader said. Orenthal's smile widened. "In exchange for 3 things, your blood, a demonstration of force ability sufficient for our researchers to map its warp interface properties, and your cooperation in one specific operation against an Imperial target we will designate, my master will open a stable passage home. Your galaxy, your war, your purpose, restored." The Strategium was very quiet. The lumens cast their wrong shadows. Valdris's hand tightened on his plasma pistol. Vader looked at Orenthal for a long moment. Not the evaluative look he gave Seren, not the assessing look he gave Castor. Something older. Something that had seen this shape of offer before in different clothes in a different galaxy, and remembered precisely what accepting it had cost. "Your master," Vader said, "offers knowledge and passage in exchange for blood, demonstration, and an action against enemies I have no quarrel with." The respirator cycling filled the silence. "This is the structure of every bargain made by every dark power I have encountered. The terms change. The architecture does not. You offer me what I want in exchange for what you want, with the mechanism of delivery controlled entirely by your side of the transaction. Orenthal's smile did not waver. You are perceptive. I am experienced. Vader's hand moved to his lightsaber, not drawing it, simply resting there. I have been the instrument of a dark power's will before. I was not offered a bargain then. I was broken and rebuilt and handed a purpose that served someone else's design while I believed it served mine. The respirator cycled. I will not negotiate from that position again. Not with your master. Not with any of the 4 powers your kind serves. Not for passage home or any other currency you believe I value sufficiently to compromise what I am. Orenthal was quiet for the first time since arriving. Its eyes settled on a single color, deep violet, the color of deep space at the edge of a nebula, and stayed there. Then you refuse, it said. I refuse, Vader said. And I will tell you what I told your master through your network of whispers. The next contact from your kind should come with something more interesting than a standard corruption attempt. If Tsench wishes to study what I am, it can do so by watching what I do in this galaxy. That will be considerably more informative than a blood sample. Orenthal looked at him for one more moment. Then it smiled. A different smile, smaller, more genuine. The smile of something that has received an answer it didn't expect and found it more interesting than the answer it planned for. Indeed, it said, and the word landed in the room with the specific weight of something that had been chosen deliberately, for an audience of one. Then it stepped sideways out of reality and the geometry of the strategium corrected itself and the shadows went back to behaving properly and Valdris exhaled through his nose with the controlled relief of a man who has survived something and is professionally required to immediately begin worrying about what comes next. The Black Legion came on the 7th day, and they did not whisper. 3 strike cruisers translated from warp space at the edge of the system with the theatrical confidence of forces that had spent 10,000 years perfecting the art of arrival as psychological weapon. Their hulls were black and gold, scarred by centuries of warfare and decorated with trophies that were visible on augur returns as irregular masses of biological material arranged with deliberate artistry along prow and flank. They broadcast on all frequencies simultaneously, a wall of sound that was part Vox transmission, part psychic pressure, part something that existed in the register between the two and affected the crew of the Purity of Macridge as a low-grade headache that arrived before the transmission did. The message was simple. It always was, with Chaos Space Marines who had been doing this long enough to distill their intent to its essential components. Deliver the anomaly or we take it. Captain Price read the transmission, set it down, picked it up again, and looked at Castor with the expression of a man revising his week's threat assessments for the 3rd time in 7 days. Get Valdris, he said. Get the anomaly. Get them in the same room. Castor found Vader in the viewport room, standing exactly where he had been standing on 4 of the 7 previous occasions Castor had checked. At the glass, watching the debris field, apparently engaged in a sustained contemplation of Cadia's remains that had not produced visible conclusions but had not been abandoned either. He delivered the situation report with the economy of language that 19 years of Astartes service had refined into something close to an art form. 3 Black Legion cruisers. Demand for surrender. Estimated boarding action window of 40 minutes if Purity of Macridge declined to comply. Vader turned from the viewport before Castor finished speaking. Abaddon sent them. We believe so. The Black Legion operates under. I know who commands them. Orenthal told me more than it intended to. He was already moving toward the door with the measured purposefulness of a man who has identified the next problem and classified it as manageable. These Chaos Space Marines. They are warrior monks who fell to corruption 10,000 years ago. Broadly accurate. They retained their combat training. Yes. And gained warp-based enhancements. Also yes. Good, Vader said, and the word carried a quality that Castor had learned, over 7 days of close proximity, to categorize as professional satisfaction. I have not had a genuine engagement since I arrived. The Inquisitor's combat psyker is competent but holds back. Your honor guard are disciplined but deferential. I have been in this room for 7 days. He paused at the door. How many will board if we allow it? Castor considered the tactical calculus. If they send a dedicated warband 30 to 50 Chaos Space Marines. Possibly a sorcerer. Possibly a Chaos spawn or two for breach entry. Allow them to board, Vader said. Castor stopped. I'm sorry. A controlled boarding engagement on ground we choose is tactically preferable to avoid battle in which the purity of Macrage absorbs weapons fire. He looked at Castor with the patience of someone explaining something they have already decided. Seal the crew to lower decks. Identify the most defensible corridor junction between the primary docking port and this section of the ship. Place your veterans there as a blocking force. Do not engage until I have made first contact. Lord Vader, with respect, 50 Chaos Space Marines. Are 50 problems I can solve more efficiently than your ship's weapons batteries can. He moved into the corridor. Tell your captain I recommend accepting their boarding request. Frame it as a tactical withdrawal to internal defense posture if that terminology is more palatable to your command structure. Price, when informed, used language that Castor had not previously heard a captain of the Ultramarines employ. Then he gave the order. The Black Legion warband came through the primary docking port 43 minutes later, breaching the airlock with a melta-charge that removed the door and 6 inches of surrounding bulkhead with the casual thoroughness of forces who had done this so many times the motion had become ritual. They were massive. Chaos Space Marines always were. Centuries of warp corruption layering enhancement upon enhancement until the original Astartes template was buried beneath something that wore it like a foundation. Their armor was black ceramite and gold trim gone green with age, hung with chains and skulls and sigils that pulsed with dim warp light. They carried bolters and chainswords, and 2 of them bore icons that made the ship's internal pict recorders produce static in their proximity. Their sorcerer led them, a figure in midnight blue robes worn over the armor, staff in hand, the warp light around him visible to baseline human eyes as a faint corona of impossible color. He stepped through the breached airlock and reached out with his psychic senses in the practiced way of someone taking a tactical survey of the battlefield through the warp rather than through his eyes. He found Vader immediately. He also found immediately that Vader had already found him. The corridor beyond the airlock was dim. Price had cut the lumen strips to emergency level at Castor's recommendation, reducing visibility to favor anyone who did not need light to navigate effectively. The warband advanced in standard breach formation, the sorcerer in the center, 2 heavy bolter marines at flanks, the bulk of the force spread behind in the practice configuration of soldiers who had been sacking ships since before most of the current Imperium's institutions existed. They made it 40 meters before Vader stepped out of a side passage and ignited the lightsaber. The crimson blade painted the corridor in red. The warband's leading edge stopped. Not from fear. Fear had been largely excised from Chaos Space Marines along with most other useful emotional responses during the long millennia of corruption, but from tactical reassessment. They had been briefed on the anomaly. They had been told, Force user, alien to this reality, energy weapon, extreme physical capability. They had been told, exercise caution. They had not quite believed it because the Black Legion had not genuinely believed in caution for a very long time. Orenthal sends his regards, the sorcerer said, with the arch confidence of a man delivering a line he has prepared. The War Master extends an invitation, Lord Vader. Service within the Black Legion. Resources. Knowledge. The warp's full navigational charts at your disposal. I gave Orenthal my answer, Vader said. The War Master hoped you might reconsider. No. The sorcerer raised his staff. The warband raised their weapons. The corridor filled with the sound of bolters cycling to ready. A mechanical chorus that Castor, watching on a picked feed from the junction position 70 meters back, had always found simultaneously terrifying and oddly musical. What happened next lasted 4 minutes and 11 seconds according to the picked feed's timestamp. Vader moved first. Not toward the sorcerer, toward the left flank, the heavy bolter marine, closing the distance in the time it took the marine to depress his firing trigger. The lightsaber took the bolter at the barrel, the cut precise and diagonal, the weapon's forward section hitting the deck as its former wielder was lifted from his feet by an invisible force and placed with significant velocity against the corridor wall. The bulkhead dented. The marine did not immediately get up. The corridor erupted. Bolter rounds, most of them. 2 plasma shots that left scorch marks across the ceiling as Vader moved beneath them with a fluidity that belonged to a different category of motion than the combatants around him. Not faster exactly, though he was faster, but differently oriented, as though he was responding to information that arrived before the physical events that generated it. The sorcerer's staff discharged a lance of coruscating warp energy that Vader deflected with the lightsaber, the blade redirecting the blast into the ceiling with a crash that showered everyone with ferrocrete dust and sparks. 3 Chaos Space Marines reached him simultaneously. The lightsaber accounted for 2 in a single crossing motion that Castor watched on the picked feed and subsequently spent considerable time trying to fully parse. A diagonal cut transitioning into a reverse horizontal that used the momentum of the first strike to power the second, the kind of form that implied a system of combat developed over decades of actual use rather than training cage drilling. The 3rd Marine got a gauntlet on Vader's shoulder, found purchase, began to exert the crushing force of Chaos Space Marine enhanced musculature, and was removed from the floor and held suspended 4 feet in the air by nothing, his armor straining against an invisible grip that tightened with the calm deliberateness of a man making a point rather than fighting for survival. "Tell me," Vader said to the sorcerer, over the sound of the suspended Marine's armor beginning to compress, "how many did Abaddon send with you?" The sorcerer, who was discovering that his warp sight was providing him threat assessments that his 10,000 years of experience had not prepared him to contextualize, made a decision. He began a teleportation ritual, the emergency extraction that Chaos forces maintained for exactly this category of tactical miscalculation. Vader looked at him. The teleportation ritual stopped. Not disrupted, not countered. Stopped the way a hand stops a door mid-swing, with simple physical authority applied to a metaphysical mechanism. "How many?" Vader said again. 50, the sorcerer said. He had the tight, careful voice of a man who has revised his threat assessment to its maximum value and is now focused entirely on the question of whether cooperation improves his survival probability. Plus the ship's complement. 3 cruisers. Enough to destroy this ship in a sustained engagement. Yes. Vader released the suspended Marine, who dropped to the deck and did not attempt to rise. He looked at the corridor, the surviving members of the warband, who had stopped advancing approximately 90 seconds into the engagement and had spent the intervening time making the series of individual calculations that resulted in no one moving. 14 of their number were down. 36 remained functional. The mathematics of the next 30 seconds were not favorable. "Return to your ships," Vader said. "Tell Abaddon what you saw. Tell him the answer remains no. Tell him that the next warband he sends should bring something I cannot simply redirect." He deactivated the lightsaber. The corridor went dark, emergency lumens casting everything in dim red. Go! They went. Even Chaos Space Marines, in possession of sufficient data, updated their tactical models. The sorcerer was last through the breached airlock. At the threshold he turned, and his expression was the complex expression of someone who has experienced something that will require considerable internal processing before it can be properly filed. "The War Master will not stop," he said. "Good," Vader said. "I would find it disappointing if he did." The Golden Throne was dying. This was not new information. The Mechanicus had known it for centuries. The High Lords had known it for decades. And anyone within the Inquisition with sufficient clearance and sufficient willingness to face uncomfortable conclusions had known it for years. The throne's systems were degrading. The stasis fields maintaining the Emperor's physical form were operating at diminishing efficiency. The psychic beacon of the Astronomicon, which guided every navigator in every fleet across a million worlds, flickered at intervals that had been getting shorter with a consistency that the Adeptus Mechanicus's most sophisticated prognostication engines projected toward a terminal point within a generation. Inquisitor Valdris knew all of this. He had known it for 11 years, since a briefing in a sealed chamber beneath the inquisitorial fortress on Titan that had left him unable to sleep properly for 6 months. He had filed it in the section of his mind reserved for facts that were simultaneously certain and unactionable, and he had continued his work because continuing work was what you did when the alternative was despair, and despair was a chaos-adjacent emotional state that an Ordo Malleus Inquisitor could not professionally afford. What he had not known, until the purity of Macridge's navigator reported it on the 8th day, was that the Astronomicon had dimmed again. Not the routine flicker of systemic degradation, something different. A momentary reduction in output that the navigator described, in her formal report, as a hesitation, as though the beacon acknowledged something and paused to consider it. She was a navigator of 40 years' experience, third generation, with the Astronomicon mapped in her warp sight the way a sailor maps stars. She had never used the word acknowledged in a navigation report before. She used it now with the careful precision of someone who understands that the word is not metaphorical. Valdris read the report. Then he read it again. Then he went to find Vader. He found him in the training bay, a space that Captain Price had allocated after the boarding engagement on the grounds that a being of Vader's capabilities required somewhere to operate that was not a viewport room, and that the ship was marginally safer if that somewhere was designated and monitored rather than improvised. Vader was running forms. That was the only word for it. Sequences of movement with the lightsaber that were clearly codified, clearly trained, each transition flowing into the next with the precision of something practiced 10,000 times until the body performed it without consulting the mind. The crimson blade traced patterns in the bay's air that left brief afterimages, geometric and purposeful, unlike anything in the Codex Astartes or any combat doctrine Valdris had encountered. He watched for a moment before speaking. The forms were not aggressive, not the explosive committed movements of combat. They were something more like meditation made physical, the body doing what the mind required to be still. The Astronomicon dimmed, Valdris said. Vader completed the sequence and deactivated the blade. I know. You felt it. I felt something respond to something in me. Presence. Vast, attenuated, stretched across unimaginable distance and time, maintaining itself through an act of will so sustained it has ceased to be an act and become simply a condition of existence. He clipped the lightsaber to his belt. Your Emperor. He is aware of me. Valdris processed this with the controlled neutrality of a man who has spent 30 years disciplining his reactions to impossible information. The Emperor has not communicated directly with anyone in living memory. His psychic output is the Astronomicon. Nothing else gets through. He did not communicate, Vader said. He noticed. There is a difference. A man in a coma can notice a sound without being able to speak. He turned fully toward Valdris. He is in there, fully present, aware of everything happening in your galaxy at some level of perception we cannot map. And he is more powerful than anything I have encountered in this reality. More powerful than your chaos gods in raw potential. Though unlike them he does not act. The non-interference protocols of his condition are not protocols, Vader said. They are physics. He cannot act without destroying the mechanism that maintains him. The throne is a prison as much as a support system. He preserves the beacon at the cost of everything else. The respirator cycled. It is a particular kind of torment, being fully aware and fully incapable. I am acquainted with the architecture of that experience. Valdris looked at him steadily. What are you saying? I am saying your Emperor is not absent. He is occupied. Entirely and permanently occupied with the single task of keeping your galaxy navigable. Vader moved to the edge of the training bay, where a bench held a data slate Seren had provided. Filled, Valdris noted, with Mechanicus schematics of the Golden Throne that were theoretically above Vader's clearance level and practically impossible for him to have obtained, which meant either Seren had provided them or Vader had acquired them through means Valdris preferred not to enumerate. The throne's degradation. Your Mechanicus has been attempting to repair it for centuries without success. The original schematics were lost. The engineering knowledge required is ancient, Vader said. He held up the data slate. The throne is not human engineering. It is ancient technology adapted by your Emperor 10,000 years ago for a purpose it was not originally designed to serve. Your Mechanicus has been attempting to repair it without understanding its foundational principles because those principles predate your civilization's technological baseline by millions of years. He set the slate down. I have spent 8 days reviewing everything Seren provided me. I have also spent 8 days in passive study of the warp and its relationship to the Force. They are not the same thing. I was correct in my initial assessment, but they interface. The Force is the organizing principle. The warp is the energy. One gives the other shape. Your Emperor understands this, which is how he built what he built. Most of your Mechanicus does not, which is why they cannot fix it. Valdris sat down. He did this without intending to, the way the body sometimes makes decisions ahead of the mind when the mind is processing something with too many implications to stand comfortably through. You're suggesting you could. I am suggesting nothing yet, Vader said. I am identifying what is true. What is true is that the throne is failing. What is also true is that I perceive its mechanics through a framework your engineers do not possess. What is also true is that I have no reason to assist the Imperium of Mankind with its foundational infrastructure crisis. He paused. And what is also true is that I have spent 8 days in this debris field learning what your galaxy is and what it costs to survive in it, and the Emperor on his throne is the only thing standing between 1 million inhabited worlds and something considerably worse than inconvenience. The training bay was quiet. The lumens hummed. Outside, the debris field drifted its patient archaeology of catastrophe. You would help, Valdris said. Not a question. A man testing the shape of a sentence he hadn't expected to form. I would assess, Vader said. An assessment requires travel to Terra. It requires access to the throne room that your Adeptus Custodes will resist with every considerable capability at their disposal. It requires Mechanicus cooperation that Seren can facilitate but her superiors will complicate. And it requires the agreement of your High Lords, who will spend 6 months debating it while the throne continues degrading. He looked at Valdris with the focused directness of someone who has already mapped the obstacles and is now determining whether the person across from him has the authority and will to reduce them. I am telling you this because you are the highest-ranking authority I have encountered with both the mandate and the pragmatism to act on information rather than procedure. Valdris was quiet for a long time, long enough that the navigator's report sat between them like a third presence in the room. If I take this to the High Lords, he said finally, it begins a political process that will outlast the urgency. Yes, if I take you to Terra directly under inquisitorial authority, I am exceeding my mandate in ways that will end my career at minimum and my life at realistic probability. Yes. And if I do nothing, the throne continues its degradation trajectory, and the Astronomicon fails in a generation. Yes. Valdris picked up his data slate. He looked at it without reading it. He set it down. He stood up. He looked at Vader with the expression of a man who has served a dying institution his entire life and has just been presented with the possibility, however dangerous and uncertain and professionally catastrophic, that it might not have to die. I will need to make some Vox calls, he said. I assumed you would, Vader said. The Vox calls took 3 days. Valdris made them from a sealed communications chamber on the Purity of Macridge's command deck, using cipher protocols that Castor had the clearance to know existed but not to know the contents of. He emerged after each session looking progressively more like a man who had been arguing with walls and had developed a complex relationship with the structural integrity of walls as a concept. On the 3rd day he emerged looking different. Not relieved, but settled. The way a man looks when a decision has been made that cannot be unmade and the uncertainty of making it has been replaced by the simpler weight of consequences. He briefed Vader, Castor, and Seren together. We are going to Terra, he said, under inquisitorial extremis authority, which I have invoked for the first time in my career, and which will require a formal tribunal review when this is concluded. An Ordo Malleus contact within the Adeptus Custodes has agreed to facilitate access. Not endorse it, facilitate it, which is a distinction that provides him deniability and provides us approximately 40 minutes inside the throne room before the Captain General's response force arrives to remove us. 40 minutes, Seren said. Her mechadendrites were doing calculations visibly. For an assessment of ancient technology that has been degrading for centuries. It is what is available, Valdris said. I recommend we make it sufficient. The journey to Terra took 11 days through warp space. The Purity of Macridge made the translation with its Geller field fully active and its navigator performing the most focused work of her career. The Astronomicon as their guide, closer and brighter with every light year, and beside it something she reported in her navigation log as a second orientation point, personal and impossible to chart. like hearing a voice you know in a crowd of strangers. She did not include that observation in her formal report. She included it in her personal log, which Valdris read and set aside without comment. Vader spent the transit in study and preparation. He reviewed Seren's schematics until he had them mapped with the thoroughness of someone who intended to find what other eyes had missed. He meditated for hours at a stretch in the training bay, not the movement meditation of the forms but stillness, the complete physical arrest of a man extending his perception outward through the Force, mapping the warp's currents and their relationship to the beacon they were traveling toward. Twice during transit the warp outside the Geller field produced phenomena that the navigator reported as unusual pressure events and that Vader described, when Castor asked, as the chaos entities testing the boundary between my attention and their access. He did not seem concerned. The entities, whatever they were, did not breach the field. They reached Terra on a gray morning. The orbital approach through traffic lanes that made the Cadian debris field look sparse. Transports, warships, pilgrim vessels, administrative craft, the endless logistical arterial flow of an Imperium's heart. The purity of Macridge was cleared through 3 successive checkpoints on Valdris's cipher authority, each checkpoint taking longer than the last as the relevant Imperial bureaucracy processed the cognitive dissonance of an Inquisitor invoking extremist protocols for a mission with no listed objective. The custodian contact met them at a private landing platform on the palace's outer tier. He was everything custodians were, gold-armored, ancient, carrying the specific quality of contained violence that distinguished the Emperor's personal guard from every other warrior caste in the Imperium. He looked at Vader for a long moment without speaking. "You are the anomaly," he said finally. "I have been called that," Vader said. "My colleagues would kill you without discussion." He turned and walked toward the interior access corridor. "Follow me and do not touch anything." The throne room was deeper than Castor had imagined and more terrible than any briefing document had prepared him for. The scale alone, the vaulted architecture of it, the machinery, the ancient systems maintaining their vigil in the dim gold light, pressed on the mind the way deep water pressed on the body, a physical reminder of depth and weight. The golden throne itself occupied the chamber's center, rising from the floor in tiers of mechanisms and life support architecture that had been added to and modified across 10 millennia until the original structure beneath was visible only in glimpses, the way old foundations show through a building's later additions. The Emperor sat at its apex. Castor did not look directly at him for more than a moment. Not from protocol. From instinct, the instinct of a man who has approached a reactor core and understands that certain sources of power are not meant to be looked at fully. Vader looked directly. He stood at the base of the throne for a full minute without moving, and the room's ambient sound, the machinery, the ventilation, the distant devotional chanting filtering through the walls, seemed to recede, as though the space between Vader and the throne was observing its own silence. Seren's mechadendrites were utterly still. Valdris had his hand on his plasma pistol with no memory of placing it there. Then Vader moved to the throne's base mechanisms and began his assessment. He worked with the focused efficiency of someone operating under a time constraint they take seriously. His gauntlet hands moved across the ancient systems with a sensitivity that had nothing to do with the gloves. The Force extending his perception into the machinery the way a surgeon extends their awareness into a patient. He spoke quietly and continuously, a low technical commentary that Seren recorded and transcribed, her mechadendrites moving in rapid notation. At 22 minutes he stopped. "I have found the primary failure cascade," he said. His voice was level in the way that level voices sometimes indicate the opposite of calm. "It is not mechanical. The degradation is not in the systems. The systems are responding correctly to a foundational problem in the throne's psychic architecture. A resonance misalignment between the stasis fields and the beacon projection mechanism. It has been worsening since the rift opened. Can it be corrected?" Valdris asked. "Yes," Vader said, "but not by an engineer. The correction requires someone who can perceive both the mechanical and the psychic architecture simultaneously and adjust their interface." He straightened. "It requires me. And it will take considerably longer than 18 remaining minutes." The custodian's vox bead chimed. His expression did not change. The Captain General's response force has been dispatched, he said. 7 minutes. Valdris looked at Vader. Vader looked at the throne. The machinery cycled its ancient rhythms, and the golden light held everything in its amber suspension, and somewhere above them the Astronomicon kept its vigil. Slightly dimmer than it had been a generation ago. Slightly dimmer than it would be a generation hence. Tell the Captain General, Vader said, that I will require 3 hours and his complete cooperation. Tell him what is at stake. The respirator cycled. Tell him the Emperor is waiting. The Captain General of the Adeptus Custodes was named Trajan Valoris, and he arrived in the throne room 7 minutes after his vox bead chimed with the controlled velocity of a man who had been moving at combat pace since the moment the alert reached him. He brought 12 custodians. They filled the chamber's entrance in gold plate and guardian spears, the specific formation of forces who have not decided whether they are here to observe or to act and are maintaining both options simultaneously. Valoris himself stopped 6 meters from Vader and conducted the most thorough visual assessment Castor had ever witnessed from a non-augmented human. Top to bottom, threat mapping, capability indexing, the whole tactical survey completed in approximately 4 seconds. Then he looked at the throne. Then he looked at Valdris. Inquisitor, he said, with the tone of a man filing a formal objection through the medium of a single word. Captain General, Valdris replied, with the tone of a man who has prepared for this conversation for 11 days, and is nonetheless finding it more unpleasant than anticipated. I invoke inquisitorial extremis authority and request. You are already past requesting, Valoris said. You are in the throne room with an unclassified alien entity. Requesting ended when you cleared the outer tier. His eyes moved back to Vader. What is it? A force sensitive from another reality, Valdris said. Arrived through the Cicatrix Maledictum. Non-chaotic. Has refused multiple Chaos recruitment attempts including direct contact from a Cientian entity and a Black Legion warband. He paused. He has identified the mechanism of the throne's degradation and believes he can correct it. Valoris was quiet for 3 seconds. Believes. Has identified the primary failure cascade, Vader said. He did not turn from the throne. Resonance misalignment between stasis field architecture and beacon projection. Worsening since the rift opened. Progressive and terminal without intervention. A pause. I can feel it from here. The mechanism is precise. Not catastrophic decay but a slow drift. Like an instrument losing its tuning across decades until the music becomes noise. Valoris looked at Seren. Archmagos. His assessment matches findings our most senior magi have approached but never articulated with this specificity, Seren said, with the careful honesty of someone whose devotion to the Omniscia outweighs her institutional loyalty in this particular moment. He perceives the psychic architecture directly. We cannot. Another silence. Longer this time. Valoris looked at the throne with the expression of a man who has guarded it for centuries and has spent those centuries knowing it was failing and being unable to do anything about it. If you damage it, he said to Vader, I will destroy you. If I damage it, Vader said, I will deserve it. Valoris stepped aside. It was not an endorsement. It was a calculation, made by a warrior of 10,000 years' experience, that the risk of action was marginally preferable to the certainty of inaction. He stationed his custodians at intervals around the chamber perimeter and took position himself at the throne's base, close enough to intervene in seconds, and watched with the focused attention of a man for whom watching and guarding were the same act. Vader worked. 3 hours and 11 minutes. Castor stood his position against the wall and watched and tried to process what he was seeing, which was difficult because most of what he was seeing was a figure in black armor standing at the base of an ancient machine with its hands moving in patterns that were sometimes mechanical. Adjusting physical components, realigning crystal matrices that had drifted microns out of true over decades. And sometimes not mechanical at all, the force extending into the throne's psychic architecture in ways that registered as changes in the room's ambient light, pressure shifts that had no atmospheric cause, and twice as a resonance that passed through every person in the chamber like a struck bell, felt in the chest rather than heard with the ears. Seren recorded everything. Her mechadendrites moved continuously, capturing data at a rate her cogitator processed and flagged and filed in categories she was creating in real time because the existing categories were insufficient. Valoris did not move from his position for the entire 3 hours. He watched Vader with the vigilance of absolute duty and the expression, gradually, of something that was not trust and not acceptance but occupied adjacent territory. The expression of a guardian who has extended his protection to include something he does not fully understand because the alternative is watching what he guards diminish. At the 2-hour mark, the Astronomicon did something. It brightened. Not dramatically, not the sudden flare of a system restored to full function. A subtle increase in output, the navigator reported later from her station 3 kilometers above in the orbiting purity of Macridge, her warp eye perceiving it as the difference between a voice speaking at normal volume and that same voice with the ambient interference around it reduced. She wept when she reported it, and included that fact in her formal log without embarrassment. In the throne room, the golden light intensified by a degree that was physically measurable and somehow more than physically measurable simultaneously. The machinery's rhythm steadied. A vibration that had been present so long no one in the room had consciously registered it until its absence made the air feel different. Vader stepped back from the throne. He stood for a moment with his hands at his sides and his helmet raised toward the Emperor above, and the quality of stillness around him was not the stillness of completion but something more complex. The stillness of a being who has looked at something vast and been looked at in return and is processing the implications of the exchange. "It is not a permanent correction," he said. "The underlying drift will resume. The architecture requires ongoing maintenance that your Mechanicus can now perform. I have shown Seren the methodology. But the immediate cascade has been reversed." He turned. "You have time. Decades rather than years. Use it." Valoris crossed the chamber in measured strides and stopped before Vader. He was taller by several inches and the gold of his armor caught the throne's light and held it like something consecrated. He looked at Vader for a long moment with the evaluating directness of the Emperor's own chosen. "The Emperor's will is not always legible to us," he said quietly. "But occasionally it becomes briefly clear." He stepped back and brought his guardian spear across his chest in the formal salute of the Adeptus Custodes, a gesture Castor had seen performed for 4 people in his entire career, all of them among the most significant figures in the Imperium's history. He performed it for Vader. Vader regarded him steadily. Then he inclined his helmet in the precise minimal acknowledgement of a man who understands ceremony without being governed by it. "Your Emperor endures," Vader said. "For now that is enough." Terra did not let them leave quietly. The political aftermath of an unauthorized entry into the throne room under inquisitorial extremist authority began generating documentation within hours of their departure from the inner palace, the imperial bureaucracy's response to crisis being, as always, the production of paperwork in volumes inversely proportional to the urgency of the situation that generated it. Valdris received the first formal censure notification before they had cleared the palace's outer tier. He read it, filed it in a pocket of his coat with the practiced efficiency of a man adding to a collection, and kept walking. The High Lords convened an emergency session within 48 hours. Castor learned this from Price, who learned it from Valdris, who described the session in a single sentence. 12 of the most powerful administrators in human history spending 6 hours arguing about something that had already happened and could not be undone. Their conclusions were predictable: a formal investigation, a tribunal for Valdris, a classified review of the throne room incident under seal of the Adeptus Custodes. Also predictable. None of it reversed what Vader had done, and none of it addressed the fact that the Astronomicon was measurably brighter than it had been a week ago. Valoris, in his formal report to the tribunal, described the incident in 11 words. The asset performed a necessary service. The outcome justified the method. He did not elaborate. The tribunal, confronted with a captain general of the Adeptus Custodes delivering 11 words and a silence that constituted the remainder of his testimony, concluded its review in record time. The purity of Macridge was reassigned to a holding orbit above Terra while the process ran its course. Vader spent the time in the training bay and the viewport room in roughly equal measure, and Castor, whose assignment as primary liaison had evolved over 3 weeks from a security posting into something considerably less categorizable. spent it in the uncomfortable position of a man who understands that the situation he is in will feature in inquisitorial records for the rest of his career and possibly longer. On the 4th day above Terra, Seren requested a meeting. She came to the viewport room with a data slate and the focused energy of someone who has spent 4 days processing a dataset that keeps generating new questions faster than it answers old ones. She set the slate on the table between them without preamble. "The methodology you showed me," she said, "for maintaining the throne's psychic architecture. I have reviewed it 14 times. I understand the mechanical components, the crystal realignment, the field calibration sequences. I do not fully understand the psychic interface component, the part that requires direct force perception." "You will not," Vader said. "Not fully. That component requires what you do not have. The midichlorians." Yes. Seren's mechadendrites were still, the stillness of careful thought rather than restraint. "In your galaxy, force sensitives, individuals with sufficient midichlorian concentration to perceive and manipulate the force. They exist in meaningful numbers. They have existed. Their numbers have been reduced by war." He looked at her steadily. "What you are asking? Whether force sensitivity exists in this galaxy," she said. "Whether the midichlorians are present in human populations here at sufficient concentrations. Whether the maintenance your methodology requires could be performed by someone native to this reality rather than dependent on your continued presence." The question sat between them with the weight of its implications fully visible. "I have been considering the same question," Vader said. "Your psychers. They perceive and manipulate the warp and the force interface. The mechanism is different, but the biological substrate, sensitivity to energy beyond normal perception, is not entirely dissimilar." He was quiet for a moment. "I cannot answer your question with certainty. I would need to examine psycher biology directly, which your protocols and my current political situation do not facilitate." "Valdris can facilitate it," Seren said, "when the tribunal concludes. If the tribunal concludes favorably." "It will," she said, with the flat certainty of someone who has done the political mathematics. "Valoris's testimony ensures it. The High Lords will censure Valdris, record the incident as irregular but justified, and classify everything above the awareness level of anyone who might ask inconvenient questions." Her optical lenses cycled once. "After which your status in this reality requires formal determination. You cannot return home through any mechanism currently available. The Chaos Powers will not stop attempting contact. 3 Mechanicus delegations from Mars have already requested access to you through official channels. I am aware. The Imperium needs what you did in the throne room," she said. "Not once. Ongoing. And potentially needs what you could identify in its psyker populations if force sensitivity and warp sensitivity share biological architecture." She picked up the data slate. "You have nowhere to return to. This galaxy has specific needs that you uniquely address. The mathematics of that situation are not complicated." Vader looked at the viewport. Terra filled it, vast, ancient, the cradle of humanity's million-year dominion, brown and gold and scarred by the weight of its own history. From this altitude, the palace was visible as a density of structures on the northern continent. A city built on a city built on a city, the accumulated architecture of 10,000 years of desperate survival given physical form. "The mathematics are not complicated," he agreed. "The implications are." "Yes," Seren said. "They are." Below them Terra turned in its slow rotation, indifferent to the conversation happening above it, carrying its billions through another day of the endless vigil that was human existence in the 41st millennium. In the throne room far below, the golden throne maintained its steadied rhythm, the resonance misalignment corrected, the cascade reversed, the beacon burning at its renewed output into the warp where every navigator in every fleet across a million worlds used it to find their way home. In the holding orbit, Vader watched the planet and said nothing further, and Castor, who had been standing at the viewport room entrance with the practiced invisibility of a good sergeant, watched Vader and understood that the silence was not the silence of a man with no answer. It was the silence of a man who had already found one. On the Strategium deck, Valdris received a priority Vox transmission from an Ordo Xenos colleague on the Eastern Fringe. A report of unusual Force-like phenomena manifesting in a population of Psychers on a world called Vandus 4, phenomena that bore no resemblance to warp corruption and every resemblance to something else entirely. He read it twice. He looked at the closed door of the viewport room. He began composing a mission briefing. Outside, in the dark between worlds, the Astronomicon burned on. And somewhere in the Eye of Terror, 3 Black Legion cruisers turned away from Terra on new heading, carrying new intelligence to a War Master who would spend considerable time determining what to do with the information that the anomaly had not left. Had, in fact, decided to stay. The galaxy had not asked for Darth Vader. It never did, with the things that changed it most fundamentally. The Horus Heresy arrived uninvited. The Tyranids emerged from beyond the galactic rim without announcement. The Great Rift tore reality open without consulting the civilizations it divided. The 41st millennium was a place that had long since stopped expecting rescue and had built its entire theology around the concept of endurance instead. You did not survive 10,000 years of continuous warfare by waiting for salvation. You survived by holding the line, section by section, world by world, generation by generation, until holding the line became the purpose itself and the thing you were holding it against almost ceased to matter. Vader understood this. He had held lines himself in a different galaxy, for reasons that had curdled over decades into something he no longer examined too closely. He understood the cost of purpose without examination. He understood, better than most beings in this reality could, what happened when darkness was served rather than mastered. The throne room had shown him something he had not expected to find in a dying god on a failing machine in a besieged galaxy. Something that in his own galaxy he had spent decades pretending did not exist and the last years of his life desperately trying to recover. A father holding on. The mission to Vandus 4 awaited. The Mechanicus delegations awaited. The Chaos Powers would send further representatives because they always did. The question of force sensitivity in Imperial Psyker populations remained open, its answer potentially reshaping the Imperium's ability to maintain the throne across generations. Darth Vader had arrived through a tear in reality with nowhere to return to and a galaxy that needed exactly what he carried. He had held lines before. He picked up Valdris's mission briefing. The gate, the Stargate's equivalent in this reality, the warp itself, awaited. If you want to see more characters enter different universes, hit that subscribe button and drop the name of a character and the universe you'd want to see them in down in the comments below. More stories await.